Ireland is a small country, so why do we spend so much time, money and emissions getting from A to B? Today on EcoEye, we'll show you just how a handful of innovative smart technologies and ways of thinking could transform the way we travel, giving us fewer, better and more fuel-efficient cars on the road. Fantastic. User-friendly public transport, safer roads and streets, and a way to break free from our dependence on oil. Ireland is a nation on the move. Every day, a vast tide of people and goods crisscross the landscape, streaming through our countryside and pushing into our towns and cities. This constant mobility is an integral part of our most modern developed economies. But like everything else, it must always adapt to new circumstances and challenges. When I was a boy, I dreamt of owning my own car. I wanted the independence, the freedom, the thrill of the open road. Our dreams of freedom are now an occasional pleasure salvaged from the daily commute. Teresa Kilmartin lives in Killucan near Mullingar and works in Dublin. Her experience of a daily commute of 75 kilometres is echoed in many homes across the country.
I sort of found that I had to keep getting up earlier and earlier to try and avoid the traffic. So I used to leave about 5:45 in the morning, and I get into Dublin about 7:10. Well, I think the main thing was it wasn't predictable. It could take anything from an hour and a half to 2 hours. I think the evenings were the worst. You're kind of edging forward and you sort of feel you're never going to get home. And I just found over the years it just got harder and harder. By the time you got home, you were frustrated, you were tired and you were stressed. So the first hour coming into the house was probably, I wasn't at my best in terms of motherhood or wifehood. And I think that's just not fair in your family either.
Personal car transport accounts for most of the congestion on our roads, as well as millions of tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. Ireland's massive investment in new roads and the lax planning controls of the past decade have left a legacy of low-density sprawl. Thousands of families like Teresa's do the best they can, travelling 50 to 60 miles just to get to work. And the streets of our towns and cities were designed for horses and carts. They just can't accommodate the number of motors on the road or the size of some vehicles today. For whatever reason, it seems that most of our spatial planning is based on the idea that it will always be relatively cheap to fill the tank. Even though your car is, most likely, the second biggest capital purchase you make after your home, it's often hard to get a real sense of what it all costs. Teresa and I got to work adding it all up. The average cost of running a car are €1,500 on tax and insurance, €4,000 on depreciation and car loans, €4,000 on repairs, parking and tolls, and €2,500 on fuel. That's €12,000 a year. Teresa's longer commute pushes her costs higher than average. By ditching the car, she could save at least €15,000 a year and gain back some of the hundreds of hours she spends on the road. She could save well over €150,000 in the life of the car. You could buy a nice house for that, couldn't you?
Huge cost, yeah.
Our petrol and diesel imports are now over $2 billion a year. Even if we were to ignore the never-ending burden on our families and society of the costs on that scale, we're soon going to have to reinvent our transport system anyway. Oil prices could double over the next 10 years as the available supply gets smaller, and the emissions are damaging our health, the environment and changing our climate. I asked Ken Mackin from the EPA about the challenges we face.
Greenhouse gases are causing significant climate change and it's going to get worse. There isn't any doubt about this. The global community has tried to address this. We have a 20% reduction for 2020 and it looks like we could be facing up to 85% reductions from 2050 on. This is what's in front of us and this is what's necessary if we are to preserve the way of livelihood for our future generations on this planet.
85% reduction, that means we'd be down to about 15% of our use of fossil fuels by 2050. That's less than 40 years away.
That's what we're facing. Not all of the technologies are in place yet to deliver that, but we need to be moving in that direction. We have certain technologies in place, for instance, in transport. We've already identified electric vehicles, biofuels, to move freight in a different way. All of these things are what we're going to have to do going forward.
Those are some of the problems and challenges, but I promised you solutions too. Some of the solutions are small changes, new pieces of technology, and new ways of using what we already have. Others require fresh thinking about how we do things, looking to the past as well as to a high-tech future. We all want clean air and a better environment, but of course we can't all completely give up the car. But there is one type of car that has less emissions and causes no exhaust pollution. This Tesla Supercar hits 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in less than 4 seconds. That's quicker than most Ferraris, and it's completely quiet because it's all electric. So Peter, how does this work?
It's basically a lot of laptop batteries all stacked up in the boot and an electric motor. It couldn't be simpler. Performance is fantastic. It's as good as a Porsche 911 or a Ferrari. It's just as quick off the mark, really. The range is about 350 kilometers on each charge, and then you need overnight to charge it. It doesn't have the fast charging some of the newer electric cars will have. It's only got one gear. It's automatic, so you don't have to change gears. You just press the pedal and it goes.
So how many miles per gallon equivalent?
Well, it's the equivalent really of 250 miles to the gallon. Of course, you're buying electricity, so the cost is actually about 2 cents per kilometre. And that would compare with an average car of about 15 cents a kilometre. So it's really, really much cheaper to run. I actually drove from Cork to Dublin on about €4 worth of electricity.
And you can make it that distance through, no problem?
You can. Now, you have to stay the night, but yeah, charge it up and drive it home again, no problem.
And how do you charge it?
Well, I plug it in at home, just an ordinary 3-pin socket is fine. It's about 8 hours from empty, but most days, you've only driven 20 or 30 miles and an hour will do it fine,
So can you plug it into a wind turbine if you had one?
You could install a small turbine in your own home and you'd have zero emission transport and pretty cheap as well.
What about CO2 emissions?
A standard car is up around 200 grams of CO2 per kilometre. The very best cars that you can buy today, even the hybrids, are around about 100. But this car on today's electricity is about 50 grams of CO2 per kilometre. But that's on today's power system. If we have more and more wind farms on the Irish power system in the future, then that'll drop right down even further. But the running costs are almost zero. The maintenance is very low indeed. It's got no clutch, no gear, no oil. It's a very easy car to own.
Well, Peter, I thought it was brilliant to drive. How do you feel about it?
It's absolutely a joy to drive. In the city, out on the open road, it's fantastic.
A high-performance Tesla for around €100,000 is out of reach for most of us, and you wouldn't get too many bags of groceries into it anyway. There are now some real practical alternatives to the petrol engine. I'm testing the new Nissan Leaf, a completely electric family car. This is my first time in the car and I'm dying to see how it performs. It's incredibly smooth. There's no gears, no sound. And look at the road holding. Here I'm on this bend here, incredibly good road holding. It's got batteries that are mounted low down underneath the seats of the car. And it's got that low centre of gravity, which gives you that extra grip. So look, we're on this bend, look at that. I couldn't do that now with my car. It's just beautiful to drive, fantastic. When you brake on this car, it regenerates, so you're actually converting that energy from the momentum of the car into charging the battery. In a typical car, that's all gone in friction and into heat, whereas in this car, it's going back into the battery. It's great. A really clever thing about this car is that if you're looking for a charging point, you can just click onto this screen here, and it's going to show you where all the charging points are, and it automatically, through the GPS, tracks you to the nearest charging point. It's fantastic. I know you're limited in the car to, they say 160 kilometres. Obviously, you're not going to take a risk and drive the full 160 and find then you're stuck. There are points now all along the main roads, so you can travel from Dublin to Cork or to Kerry or to wherever and pick up your charge along the way. I was down in Tralee yesterday, and there were 3 charging points in the centre of the town. That's really good. If we in Ireland can convert to electric cars, and if we make sure that our power is going to be more and more from renewables such as wind energy, then all of our transport for cars could be zero carbon.
Electric cars may still be expensive to buy. But if you apply our lifetime costs approach, the gap gets smaller and will continue to do so as the technology becomes more mainstream, more usable and cheaper. They'll play a big part in our transport future. Electricity is only one of the options for fueling transport in the future. Countries like Sweden and Austria have developed the use of biogas to power public and private transport. Biogas could be home-produced, it's renewable, a third cheaper than oil, and zero CO2 emissions. Ireland has a lot of unproductive land. If grass from it was combined with cattle slurry and other organic waste, we could create a new industry, new jobs, and potentially reduce fuel imports by up to 2 billion per year. But right now, there are no incentives to develop a sustainable biofuel industry in Ireland. Biogas is working well for other countries, so it could work for us too.